إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغن عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين. ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وظللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون آمنت بالله صدق الله العظيم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد خاتم النبيين وإمام المرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد قال جل وعلا في كتابه المبين وما كان الله ليعذبهم وأنت فيهم وما كان الله معذبهم وهم يستغفرون. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Glad to be back this month. I think was last month. Today I'm going to have to leave a little bit early, so I do apologize. My trains, the last train's earlier than expected, so the order slightly changed for the gathering. I want to talk about a couple of things, or maybe a few things actually, that I feel are quite important. The last time I was here, I talked about the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, and our purpose, or the purpose of our life in relation to him. And it's good to meet up and sing and also read the Quran and have that spiritual benefit, but at the same time, we should always have something to take away that we can kind of apply for the following week or the following days or the following months. It's very important to do that. And knowledge is ma huwa yanfa. It should be something that benefits us spiritually. And I want to begin with the idea that anything that we do when we're in the process of learning, or in the process of learning, it must be that what we learn is something that will primarily benefit our souls. Of course, there are things that are required for the dunya, but they shouldn't be at the expense of our spiritual state of being. The Messenger of God said, "A'udhu billahi min ilmin la yanfa." I seek refuge from knowledge that doesn't benefit me. And it should be important to us that we learn something. As Imam Ghazali said, that if you don't put something in your heart every day of ilm, and what he meant by that is something that benefits the soul, that slowly the heart will die away and there'll be very little left of spiritual connection to God. Today, inshallah, I want to talk about the metaphysical dimension of the Prophet ﷺ, as brief as I can be and as simple. I want to begin with, and I think I mentioned this last time as well, but it's probably important to repeat it, with a statement of the last Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, Sheikh Mustafa Sabri, rahimahullah, who said that the fall of the Muslims in the early 1900s, he really was talking about the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate, was due to two underlying reasons. Number one, the fact that the concept of ummah had now disappeared. So Muslims didn't appreciate the idea of being a big community, a worldwide community, or that every Muslim country as we see it now, every culture is connected by this very word ummah. And as we know, the word ummah were divided into nation states and lost that identity. That was one of the two reasons, primary reasons why we faded away into an abyss, really. The second reason, and that's the reason I want to talk about today, was that the Muslims became detached from the meta dimension of the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. And that is to say that by the metaphysical, I mean the things that are not physical, of course. What we see now is, especially in the last 50 years, 60 years, with the type of da'wah that we've seen. Should I move it forward? That everybody says, let's revive the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, follow the sunnah. And somehow they have separated the person from the path, in a sense. That the Messenger of God as a person, the person of the Prophet ﷺ, the that of the Messenger of God, has been almost or is seen as something insignificant. That the Prophet ﷺ came, he delivered a message, and then he went. تِلْكَ الْأُمَّةَ قَدْ خَلَتْ. And therefore, what happens if you have that state of mind is, you assume the Messenger of God to merely be a vessel that delivers the wahy, the revelation, and that's it. He's reduced to that. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ is much more than that. And it's for us, and our tradition is very clear on that metaphysical dimension of the Prophet ﷺ, and how it's incumbent on every Muslim to attach himself to the Prophet ﷺ in that way. Scholars have tried 1400 years, every century, to write on the topic, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books have been written on that topic. Maybe they knew that a time would come where people would do such a thing. In fact, there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that Imam Clichy mentions, that do not treat me like people treat a vessel of water, leather vessel of water, where once they finished with it, they spill the water onto the floor. And the idea in that particular hadith, Clichy states, is that people cease sending salawat on the Messenger of God. Imam Abdul Wahhab Sha'rani rahimahullah ta'ala famously said that in his particular time, that he felt that the spiritual masters had completely disappeared. it was around quite a long while ago. If that's the case then, it's certainly the case now. And he said, for the end of times, the way to stay connected to the Messenger of God is through salawat, specifically. What I want to look at is the Shama'il al-Tirmidhi, the famous Shama'il description of the Prophet ﷺ, authored by Abu Isa Tirmidhi. It's important where it begins and where it finishes. It begins with physical features of the Prophet ﷺ, specifically the face of the Messenger of God and the body, and it ends the last chapter, not the last narration, because the last narration is about sanad, but the last chapter is on seeing or beholding the vision of the Messenger of God alayhi salatu, in a dream or in a wakeful state, as has been really pretty much unanimously accepted by all Muslims, scholars. And so he finishes right there. And the reason he does that is so that you paint a picture in your mind of the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasallam. And therefore, at the end of the book, we covered, I think over 6 weeks or something, we did the Shama'il here. So when you get to the end of the book, and now you're well acquainted with the description, you now yearn to see him. That's essentially the point. So he mentions all these narrations about the Messenger talking about people seeing him in their dreams. Man ra'ani fil manami sayarani yaqdatan. Man ra'ani fil manami ra'a al-haqqa. فَإِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ لَا يَتَصَوَّرُ بِي. And all these ahadith that whoever sees me has truly seen me. Whoever sees me in a dream will see me in a wakeful state, or whoever will see me in a dream will surely it will be me, for indeed the devil cannot take my form. The devil is prohibited from taking the form of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, what was the point of that particular chapter? The idea of that chapter is that one's you could say mission in life is that they not only have that relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, but they can bear the fruits of that relationship. And to bear those fruits is to see him. In the Akhirah, a very interesting statement by Subki, that in that particular hadith, مَنْ رَآنِ فِي الْمَنَامِ سَيَّرَانِ يَقْدَةً, he who sees me in a dream will see me in a wakeful state. Some people said, and this is the position of some scholars, said that what that means is you will see him on the Day of Judgment. Subki, who's a great scholar, said it doesn't mean that, because even the kuffar get to see the Prophet ﷺ on the Day of Judgment. There's no special, that's not a kind of a distinct honor in that sense. But this hadith is talking about a distinct honor for the believer who sees the Prophet ﷺ in his dream. That there's an inference there of a proximity or closeness to the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam. And of course, probably millions of Muslims have seen the Prophet ﷺ in their dreams. To quote you one story, and there are hundreds probably, but one of my students, a very long time ago, he was a convert to Islam. And he told me that before he converted, so I asked him his conversion story. He was actually a soldier for the British Army in Afghanistan. He was very young, maybe 19, 20 years old. And he told me that after he came back, being deployed in Afghanistan, in Greece for a short while, he was depressed and he took to drinking a lot of alcohol, and he had PTSD. And he told me that he fell asleep one day and he saw the Messenger of God in his dream. This man was not a Muslim at that time. And he even described him to him. And he had already converted when he told me the story. There are many such stories that you find that random people will see the Messenger of God in their dreams. And so what's interesting is even the great translator, Mukhtar Holland, who's passed away, rahimahullah, his conversion story was amazing. Before he became Muslim, he had a dream that a man was riding a horse and he stopped at a distance and he fired an arrow into his chest. And then later he became a Muslim and he had the dream interpreted. And it was interpreted as it was a messenger of God placing Iman in his chest. So the idea of seeing or beholding the vision, or seeing the messenger of God, was something that all Muslims strived for in their lives. So if one doesn't build that metaphysic, that kind of spiritual relationship, it's very difficult to do that. And if one doesn't have a connection of salawat, it's very difficult to do that. I mean, you'll read the Burda in a short while. Al-Busiri, for instance, interestingly, it's not mentioned in all of the commentaries, but Kharputi mentions in his commentary that the author of this, Al-Busiri, was a man of the dunya. and he would sing or write poetry for kings and for leaders. And he went to somebody's house one day to sing some poetry for that. Maybe he'd get some money out of it, which is a very poor man. He was a clerk for the government. He didn't have a very good job, and he had a lot of children. And so he went there and he met an old man. And this old man, he looked at him, he walked into the house, and he seemed a pious old man. And the man said to him, he said, "How ra'ayta Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam?" He said, "Did you see the messenger of God last night?" It's a very odd thing to ask somebody. And Busiri said, "No, I didn't see the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam." And he said, "Okay." And he just left him to it. And then he said, "When I got home, I felt like a burning passion. Something was amiss. That why did that man ask me that question? So I yearned to see the messenger of God. And that very night I saw the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and I made an oath that I would give up singing poetry for leaders and kings." And then famously after, he authored the Hamziya, and he authored the Burda, Aqwaqib al-Durriya, and many other poems he authored in praise of the messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. So this idea of yearning to see the messenger of God should be the yearning of every believer, the ishtiyaq of every believer. In fact, the companions, that was really the only access they had to the Prophet ﷺ after he passed away. And some of their dreams are documented. Sayyidina Bilal's is the most famous dream, where the Prophet ﷺ comes in his dream after he moves to Damascus. And he says to him, "Oh Bilal, you have become dry with us." And he constantly comes in the dream of Bilal for 3 or 4 days, and the Sayyidina Bilal realizes that he has to go back to the city. And the story is quite long, but you see that occur amongst the companions of the Messenger of God. What I want to mention here is that recently we published a book. I've not come to plug the book. We've got a seminar for that coming up in London soon anyway. But one of my teachers translated it. It's a book by Sayyid Muhammad bin Alwi al-Maliki. And we worked on it for quite a long time, and it's been published now. It's called The Lives of the Prophets and Their Graves. If you want to purchase it, you can get it on, if you Google Ghazali Institute, inshallah, you'll find it on their website. Ishaq can repeat the details at the end. The reason this book is so important is because, as I told the publishers, that I believe it's a post-Shama'il work. When you get to the end of the Shama'il of the Messenger of God, what it doesn't tell you is where the Prophet ﷺ is now, how he lives now, what type of life he has right now. The Shama'il stops because the Shama'il was to describe the life of the Prophet ﷺ amongst his companions. The last chapter alludes to this idea that the Prophet ﷺ is living. This book documents, Sayyid Muhammad Alawi rahimahullah ta'ala, documents many proofs of how the prophets are alive in their graves and what life means in that particular realm of existence in the barzakh, or in alamul mithal, in the world of similitude or imaginary representation. That the Prophet ﷺ there is living, and his life is not like the life of other people that are also in that realm. One of the reasons being is the following: there's a difference of opinion amongst the ulama that if you see the Prophet ﷺ in your dream, but you do not see him ala suratihi al-asliya, you do not see him as he was in the world, that you have not seen him. This is the opinion of Abdullah ibn Abbas. A man came to Abdullah ibn Abbas, a cousin of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he said, "I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam." And he said, "Describe him to me." He described him, and he said, "You haven't seen him." He said, "You only see him if you see him as he was in the dunya." But that was only Abdullah ibn Abbas's opinion. In fact, the vast majority of ulama state that's not the case. In fact, the fact that somebody sees the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a different representation, it means it is the messenger of God, but there's ibra. There may be a lesson, or there may be an indication of a defect in you that the Prophet ﷺ is trying to highlight. And because he exists now in this realm where he can take these forms, and his form then represents a very, very particular meaning. And this is what ulama will interpret those particular dreams. However, they say that if you see the Prophet ﷺ in his perfect form, which is difficult for a lot of people, it's almost a martaba that's ali. It's a rank that's quite high to see the Prophet ﷺ in his perfect form. Some people, they never get to see the Prophet ﷺ in his perfect form. They see him in the form of light. They hear just his voice. They see him covered, for instance, by a blanket or something, and they know he's sleeping there. Many other ways they see him, or they see him in a particular way that with his head uncovered, or with no beard, or something like that. Each one means something different. So Number one, of course, we first and foremost we pray that we receive that type of vision. Number one, of course, it gives people more yaqeen. يعني يزيد المكين يقين على كل أحد. It increases certainty in everybody. But however, once you see the message of God in your dream, you just yearn to see Him even more. That would be the idea. Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani, for instance, wrote an entire book on different methods to see Him, alayhi salatu wasalam. Another Hadrami scholar, a scholar from Hadramaut, I actually translated the book, but I can't find it. It's a book called Al-Wusul ila Ru'yat al-Rasul, Reaching the Vision of the Messenger of God, where he mentions, I think, over 50 ways on how to see the Prophet ﷺ. And not only that, after each method, he said, وَهَذَا مُجَرَّبٌ. He said, this has been tried and tested by the people of God. But what does it tell us that the prophets are alive in their graves, and what does that matter to us? I want to mention maybe 3 narrations. But before that, the verse that I read, inshallah, that's the wrong time here. Allah mentions in the Quran, and this verse, when I was in Damascus, one of the ulama gave his interpretation to the verse, and I was really taken aback by it. Allah says in the Quran, وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُمْ وَأَنْتَ فِيهِمْ. Let's be honest, I mean, if we look at the world now and the level of oppression that goes on, be it governments, be it individuals, whatever it may be, the dhulm that we see, people taking other people's rights away, people murdering others. Just on the way here, I was telling the brothers here, just I think the last week in Birmingham, all these kids are killing each other. I mean, one 14-year-old was stabbed and shot dead. Stabbing him wasn't enough. If you look at the kid who did it, he was only 14 or 15 years of age, in absolute insanity. And the world that we live in now, dhulm is something that's everywhere. The Prophet ﷺ said a time will come where a person will kill another person and he will not know why he killed him, nor will the one who is killed know why he was killed. Now, but dhulm is there. It's enough that we have enough dhulm in the world, enough oppression, that if God wanted to finish this world and end it like He finished other Aqwam of Thamud and Ad, God could do it, and we wouldn't have anything to complain about. There'd be no shikwa. We'd say, Allah states, about people being replaced by other people. But we would have no complaint. The way we have treated the environment, the way we've treated each other, we would have no complaint. But yet Allah states in the Quran, وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُمْ وَأَنْتَ فِيهِمْ, that God will not do that. He will not punish people. And this ta'zeeb here is in reference to the end of the Day of Judgment. God will not finish the world or end the existence of man in the world. As long as وَأَنْتَ فِيهِمْ, you are amongst them. And God is talking about the messenger of God. There are 2 interpretations to this verse. One of the interpretations is that as long as the messenger of God is alive amongst people. But many tafsirs do not mention that. They say as long as there exists a believer in the world that loves the messenger of God, God will not cause for the war to end. Now, how we know that is the fact that the famous hadith of the wind that Tirmidhi mentions and others, that the last group of believers will not die until God sends forth a wind and it kills them. And after that, there will be no believing men or women in the world. And only the wretched people will exist. And then the Day of Judgment will come, which is an indication that there will be nobody around that loves the messenger of God anymore, or has a special place in their heart that's attached to the Prophet ﷺ. The other meaning to this verse, of course, is the following verse. وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ مُعَذِّبَهُمْ وَهُمْ يَسْتَغْفِرُونَ. That even if the messenger of God passes away, God will not destroy mankind as long as there are people that make istighfar, that seek God's forgiveness. Well, I prefer the first interpretation, that as long as the messenger of God lives in our lives, in our hearts, then we have a chance, one, to make istighfar, but also a chance to spiritually be reformed, that we can almost hazard a guess at least that the Day of Judgment isn't coming next Friday, considering it will be on Yom al-Jum'ah. Now, how are prophets alive? I want to mention two or three hadith that are discussed in this book only. The Prophet ﷺ walked past a mountain on the night of Mi'raj, and there he said, رَأَيْتُ مُوسَى قَائِمًا فِي قَبْرِ يُصَلِّي. Imam Nawawi mentions, Imam Muslim mentions this hadith. So I saw Moses in his grave, standing and praying. There's another hadith that's closely linked. رَأَيْتُ كَأَنِّي أَرَى يُونُسَ بْنَ مَتَّى فِي الْوَادِ يُلَبِّي. I saw Yunus ibn Matta, the Prophet Yunus, on a red she-camel in a valley in Mecca making talbiyah. In another hadith, he said, I saw a man in the dunya. He gave salam to me, and only later did I know who he was, or did I recognize him. He was my father Ibrahim alayhi salam. The prophets are living, and in that state, Imam al-Nawawi in his commentary to hadith of Musa alayhi salam, states, Al-Anbiya'u, the prophets, they make Umrah and Hajj every single year in that dimension, in that spiritual realm. Yet sometimes they unveil themselves to people in a wakeful state. Now, I haven't got time to elaborate that point, but it's reached a state of mutawatir, of tawatur, mass transmission, of the stories we have where sometimes hundreds of people witness the Messenger of God in a wakeful state. Shaykh Ahmad al-Rifai is one famous one. This is not, some people may say, oh, that's completely subjective or speculative, and it would be if there were one or two stories. When we have hundreds of people, sometimes over 1,000 people. For instance, Sa'id ibn Musayyib. Now, if you don't take it from somebody 800 years later, Shaykh Ahmad al-Rifai, 400-500 years later, 600 years after the Prophet ﷺ, at least take it from Sa'id ibn Musayyib. Sa'id ibn Musayyib is a tabi'i. He's a man who met Sahaba, he's a student of the Sahaba. In the rule of Yazid ibn Muawiyah, there were a group of people from Harra. They went to Abdullah bin Umar. Abdullah bin Umar is a famous companion, the son of Sayyidina Umar. They said, look, we want to start a rebellion against Yazid. He warned them, he said, you do not have the manpower to do it. And so they continued anyway, they didn't take his advice. And Yazid, of course, slaughtered them. He took his horses into the masjid of the Messenger of God. He did terrible things. And the historic position of Sunni tradition, I've never respected him. You'll never find a book on the Manaqib of Yazid. You don't write books on treacherous, and in fact there's a khilaf on Abu Faraj al-Jawzi, the great Abdul Rahman, wrote an entire book refuting anybody who believes that you can't curse Yazid. Now, Sa'id al-Musayyib, he hid in the masjid. He thought somebody would kill him, so he hid in the masjid. He thought, what safety is there unless it's with the Messenger of God? So he hides in the masjid. So they asked him once he got out, they said, how did you pray? Like you were hiding somewhere. Well, how did he keep his wudu for that long? I know some people, they keep their wudu for a very long time. 2 or 3 days. You must have slept in a particular way if you took the Hanafi position. But anyway, how did you know the time of prayer? Because the place he was hiding, it was difficult to tell. He said, I could hear a humming of the adhan from the grave of the Messenger of God. Alayhi salatu wasalam. This is the life that we're talking about, the ithmas life, the life of the in-between, the intermediary realm, the life of barzakh. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith narrated by Tabarani, and the addition is narrated by Bazar in his Musnad, which is Sahih. Hadith Abu Darda and other narrations that in al-hayati khayrun lakum wa in al-wafati khayrun lakum. Indeed, my living is good for you and my dying is good for you. So the companion said, we know that your living is good for us. Your revelation comes, you benefit us, you sit in our company. But how will your dying be good for us when we bury you? When if we buried you in the earth, how will your dying be good for us? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Tu'radu a'malukum alayya." Your actions are shown to me every single day. In some narrations, I know you by your name and your father's name. In other narrations, I know you by your name and your mother's name. In the hadith of Salawat, he said, I see your actions are shown to me. If you do good, hamidullah. And if you do bad, meaning I praise God. And if you do bad, astaghfirullah lakum. I make istighfar on your behalf. Allah states in the Quran, وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ إِذْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ جَاءُوكَ فَاسْتَغْفَرُوا اللَّهَ وَاسْتَغْفَرَ لَهُمُ الرَّسُولُ لَوَجَدَ اللَّهَ تَوَّابًا رَحِيمًا. When they wronged themselves, sinned, mankind, جَاءُوكَ, had they come to you, فَاسْتَغْفَرُوا اللَّهَ, and they asked God for forgiveness, and the Messenger of God asked forgiveness on your behalf, only then, لَوَجَدُ اللَّهَ تَوَّابًا رَحِيمًا لَمْ لِتَأْكِيدٍ. Indeed, most certainly they would have found God oft forgiving. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said that angel has been allotted for a particular angel for one purpose and one purpose only. His job is merely at the moment, and he's in millions of places at the same time, of course, that he collects salawat, he sits on the lips of mankind. As Sheikh Salih al-Farfu and Imam Suyuti in his book mentions as well. And he takes the salawat, the salutation, and he collects it and he takes it to the Messenger of God and presents it. And in that hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, I know you by your name and your father's name. And in another narration, I know you by your name and your mother's name. Our names are known to the Messenger of God ﷺ. That's a form of relationship that we have, because there's a misunderstanding sometimes that, we send all these salawat, but does the Messenger of God know us? Do we have that relationship with him? Well, it's a two-way relationship. And if you think to yourselves of the profundity of knowing that the Messenger of God knows our names, what we look like, who we are, what we've done. Some of the ulama state, but what of the actions that are shown to the Prophet ﷺ? What of the action? We do such bad things, like are bad actions shown to him in that way? They say no, that in the alamul mithal, in the world of similitude, the actions are presented in a certain way, and the Messenger of God isharatan knows what you've done, and he asks for forgiveness. It's your no. Do you want to talk? Yeah. So, my general kind of reminder today to myself and everybody else, and I'll finish on a couple of points, inshallah, is that life is short, and I mentioned this in the last Mawlid. We don't have very long, and the Prophet ﷺ, who doesn't want to be close to the Messenger of God on the Day of Judgment? What an honor it will be on the Day of Judgment that we're this one. What honor it will be on the Day of Judgment to rise, and I wanted to mention just a point about this, which is almost a point of love. In the hadith, the first people to rise on the Day of Judgment are the prophets. The Prophet ﷺ said, a hadith which is documented by Sheikh Abdullah Sirajuddin in his famous book Al-Iman bi Awalim al-Akhirah. أول من يقصى يوم القيامة Ibrahim. The first one to be clothed on the Day of Judgment with the clothing of the Day of Judgment is Abraham. So he asks the question that the Prophet ﷺ is the greatest of God's creation. Why isn't he the first? He said all of these hadith exclude the Prophet ﷺ. That's assumed that the Prophet will be the first. And the order is very simple, that the Prophets are the first to rise. After the Prophets rise, Jannatul Baqi', the closest graveyard to the Messenger of God, the people arise. And we know the people that are buried there and why they rise first. Say the Fatima to Zahra alayhi salam, closest people to the Prophet and the companions. After which they say Ma'la or Mu'alla rise in Makkah. Now interestingly, Makkah is far away from Medina Munawwara. Why Mu'alla or Ma'la? Why is that graveyard preferred immediately after? Because the wife of the Messenger of God, Sayyidah Khadijatul Kubra, radiyallahu anha, is buried there. And we forget the level of love and the amount of love that he had for her. In fact, when he returned in Fatul Makkah, Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina, his house had been usurped from him, the Messenger of God. Somebody had taken his house, his home. And out of mercy, he let the person have it. So somebody may ask, where did he stay? He pitched his tent next to the grave of his wife, radiyallahu anha, who had passed away, Sayyidah Khadijatul Kubra. And he waits for her at that moment. After which the pious, the martyrs, etc., they rise, and the wretched rise at the end. And the idea is that when we rise, where do we want to be? Allah states in the Quran that every person shall rise behind the Imam. Where would we want to rise on the Day of Judgment? Either we're in the camp of the Messenger of God, or we're in the camp in which Imam Muslim mentions in his Sahih, that a group of people come to the Prophet ﷺ and the angels turn them away. And he said, why are you? He said, Ilayya, Ilayya. He said, let them come. They're my companions. Many ulama state that this is in reference to the people who stopped paying zakat after he passed away. And others say, no, the people who come after. Anyway, the angels say, you do not know how they left you away after you. And he says, suhqan. He said, take them away from me. Remove them from me. Either it's that camp. So we hope, inshallah, that we can build that relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, and everybody should yearn to see him. Everybody. And instill in the hearts of your children, from a very young age, that they should always wish to see the Prophet ﷺ in their dreams. Always wish to see him, alayhi salatu, in their dreams. And some do, young children. But little children come to me, and I remember one young boy came to me. His mother came to me and she said and I'll finish with this story. And he was 7 years old, I think. And he is now 21, I think. That's a long time ago. So she said, tell him your dream. He said, I saw the Prophet ﷺ. So I said, describe him to me, describe him to him. I said, what happened? He said, he gave me an ice cream. And the ulama interpret that to be a sign of wilaya in older age. Like Sheikh Allawi ibn Ali's mother, when he was a child, had a dream where the Prophet ﷺ placed a rose in her hand, and it was the fact that she would give birth, or her son would become one of the great arifin. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لي ولكم وأتوب إليه وسائر المسلمين الحمد لله رب العالمين السلام عليكم.
Jazakumullahu khair. Inshallah. Hopefully we can catch you next month as well.
Yeah, inshallah. What's the date?
Inshallah, the first Friday next month.
December.
Yeah,
khair.
Inshallah. Excellent. Inshallah, we'll have a small break. It's about 10-15 minutes. Just would like to say a special thank you to everyone who's brought food in, mashallah. I think it's quite a bit of food as well. And a special mention to one of our dear committee members, granddaughter Zainab, who's, I believe, turned 11. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep her steadfast on this religion and keep her under the shade of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I mean, please, there's plenty of food, I think, coming. Please enjoy, inshallah, 10-15 minutes, inshallah, and then we'll continue then. Shukran.
So 9 o'clock.